A northeasterly wind hurled pellets of ice against the apothecary's slate roof, producing a mournful, scraping sound. A young woman in a brown woolen cardigan emerged, telling a small boy standing before the door to take the mug to the lady of the house and to hurry, lest the restorative tonic grow cold. The child, a short, stocky figure who barely reached an adult's waist, was swallowed by a threadbare gray coat, resembling a little field mouse that had just survived a harsh winter. He accepted the wooden tray with practiced obedience, his voice a soft murmur as he told the maid, whose name was Sarah, that she should go back inside, away from the cutting wind. With that, he turned and made his way, somewhat unsteadily, along the flagstone path. The apothecary, where herbs of power were prepared, had to be kept free from stray etheric contamination, and was thus situated in the secluded woods far from the main residence. Delivering its preparations to the masters required traversing a long, seldom-used trail. Sarah watched the boys retreating back, a pang of sympathy tightening her chest. She wondered aloud how it was that two boys could both be young masters. Yet this one, the third, was so wretched. Another maid, coming out to scrub a cauldron, remarked with a dismissive curl of her lip that it was hardly surprising. He was the bastard son of a dead man. He could hardly expect to live in luxury. She added that no matter how much he was bullied, he was still one of the empowered, an ether wielder, unlike them, who were merely mundane servants performing menial tasks. Leo walked briskly over the flagstones until he reached a covered walkway, where his pace slowed dramatically. He carefully placed the tray on a stone bench, unconcerned that the slanted sleet might cool the tonic, and began to rub his frozen little hands together. It had not been long since his rebirth, and he was still unaccustomed to this small frame. He glanced down at his thin wrists. The bones were straight and perfectly formed, showing no signs of having ever been shattered. He wondered why he could barely manage the weight of a simple tray. The memories of his past life were still vivid, a lifetime of brutal power and fear condensed into the blink of an eye. The great Archon, whose name was a terror throughout the lands, had inexplicably returned to his childhood, to these difficult years as the unwanted third son of the Ashworth family. Waves of steam rose from the ceramic mug, carrying the unavoidable stench of harrowroot. Leo's brow furrowed in distaste. Harrowroot was a superior herb for soothing the spirit and calming the soul, but it had one significant drawback: a pungent odor reminiscent of ammonia. While growing, the smell was only noticeable up close, but when brewed into a decoction, the steam carried its acrid scent, which curled like white vapor in the cold air, sharp enough to cause a headache. For a family like the Ashworths, lords of a vast domain, harrowroot was a considerable luxury, not something brewed for casual consumption. The recent, sudden death of the eldest son had left Mrs. Ashworth overwhelmed with grief, damaging her spirit, which was why she had ordered the apothecary to prepare it. He stroked his left wrist with a single finger, a sense of unfamiliarity washing over him at the absence of the protruding, jagged bone he remembered. Leo let out a quiet, scornful laugh. As far as he could see, the cold, slate-gray rooflines of the Ashworth estate were just as he recalled from his childhood. Why, then, was the eldest son dead so early? He was certain he had killed that man himself years into his adulthood. What year was this even? A grating voice, typical of a boy in the throes of puberty, shattered Leo's thoughts. He was asked, with mock surprise, if it wasn't his dear third cousin. Caleb, the second son, dressed in a royal blue cashmere coat and a small fur cap, swaggered toward him, a sharp-eyed attendant in tow. The sword at his waist swung out with his exaggerated gait, revealing a fist-sized Ethereum crystal set into its pommel. Even under the gloomy sky, The crystal's high clarity made it dazzlingly bright. The price of Ethereum was not yet as exorbitant as it would become in a few years, but it was still valued at an ounce of gold per ounce of crystal. The Ashworths forbade their children from wearing such large stones within the estate in times of peace. This one not only wore it but flaunted it, as if desperate to show everyone how pleased he was by his brother's death. Leo inwardly cursed him for an idiot, bowing his head and wringing his small, red hands together in a display of helplessness. He uttered a quiet greeting to the young master. Caleb had always enjoyed seeing him in this state of humble cowardice, and Leo hoped the act would be enough to dismiss him. He did not yet have a clear grasp of his current situation and wished to avoid trouble. Today, however, Caleb was not so easily satisfied. With a rasp of steel, he drew his sword and used its tip to lift Leo's chin. It was a gesture their deceased elder brother had often made. Perhaps giddy with the prospect of becoming the family heir, the boy, who usually cared for little beyond his own pleasure, was bold enough to imitate his brother. The Ethereum on the pommel pulsed with a faint yo lang de guang, and a surge of power instantly flooded the blade. It radiated from the tip, inflicting a series of fine, scratch-like cuts on the tender skin of Leo's chin. Crimson trickles of blood slid down Leo's neck and into his collar, yet he did not even flinch. His eyes remained downcast, his expression placid, as if he felt no pain at all. He merely stated that the tonic needed to be delivered to the lady of the house quickly, before it got cold. The ammoniac smell was tolerable while hot. If allowed to cool, drinking it would be no different from drinking urine. If Mrs. Ashworth was displeased, she would undoubtedly take her anger out on him. Caleb seemed intrigued by this. He withdrew his sword and gave his attendant a meaningful look. He mused that delivering a tonic was of no importance. First, his dear cousin should test Leo's progress in his studies. The attendant, Trent, was one of the most promising among the younger generation of house guards and had formerly been the eldest son's lackey. Upon receiving the signal, Trent expertly seized Leo by the collar and dragged him to a secluded spot behind a cluster of granite boulders. He tossed an iron sword, one without an Ethereum crystal, at Leo's feet. The weapon's excessive weight sent Leo stumbling back several steps before he could regain his footing. He awkwardly tried to adjust his grip, nearly slipping and falling. The sight of the small child holding a long sword nearly as tall as himself was rather comical. Leo's fingers brushed against the empty Ethereum socket on the pommel, and his eyes darkened slightly. A sword without an Ethereum crystal was like a millstone without water. It relied solely on the wielder's own ether. With his current strength, he would struggle even against the unskilled Caleb, let alone Trent. Caleb, who had followed them with a smug grin, clearly did not understand the concept of bullying the weak. He handed his own Ethereum-studded sword to Trent. A vast wave of power washed over them. Before the blade was even fully unsheathed, Leo had hugged the iron sword and rolled away, narrowly dodging a vicious slash of energy that shattered the rocks behind him. As skilled as Trent was, he was only 13 and lacked the ability to unleash truly devastating attacks, which gave Leo a chance to evade. The sleet, now falling harder, pelted his face with a sharp, crackling sound. His worn coat became embedded with grit and dead leaves as he scrambled across the ground, the sharp stones digging painfully into his skin. Caleb roared with laughter, watching Leo scurry and roll like a frightened groundhog, completely oblivious to the faint wisps of light seeping from his and Trent's bodies. After dodging a dozen more strikes, Leo, though knowing exactly where the next blow would land, found he could no longer move. The sword came down from above. He had no choice but to kneel and raise his own blade to block it. With a sharp crack, the iron sword, as brittle as a dry twig, snapped in two. The powered blade was about to shear off half of Leo's shoulder. Caleb showed no sign of stopping the attack. In fact, his laughter grew louder. The energy from the sword sliced through the stray hairs on Leo's forehead. At that very moment, the small body flickered like a phantom, instantly appearing at Trent's side and swinging the broken half of his sword. A spray of blood erupted from Trent's neck, splattering across the stunned Caleb's face. Before he could react, Leo's hand had clamped onto the crown of his head, fingers curled like claws. Caleb felt his soul being torn and dragged by an invisible force, threatening to rip free from his body. He tried to scream, but only a weak, distorted gasp escaped his lips. He knew this person could not be his meek, bullied cousin. He must be possessed by some malevolent spirit. Hearing this thought, Leo chuckled softly. He leaned in close to Caleb's ear and whispered that he was a wraith from the abyss, summoned by a higher power to give him a taste of true soul-shattering despair, and asked if the young master was pleased. His fears confirmed, Caleb let out a silent scream, his eyes bulging as if they would pop from their sockets. Saliva dribbled from his gaping mouth, his face frozen in an expression of ultimate terror. He fainted dead away. A translucent, ethereal form slowly seeped through Leo's fingers like compressed tofu. After squeezing it twice, Leo abruptly released his grip. The soul fell back into the body like a drop of water sinking into mud. Killing Caleb now would not be a wise move. Tossing the broken sword aside, Leo was struck by a sudden wave of dizziness. He leaned against the rock face, panting for a moment, then staggered back to the covered walkway. He seized the now lukewarm cup of harrowroot tonic and drank it all in one go. The taste was truly unpleasant, but after finishing the cup, the feeling of the world spinning around him subsided. Leo sighed. His body was small and weak, his soul exceptionally frail. He needed to leave this wretched Ashworth estate as soon as possible. He placed the broken sword in Caleb's hand, then pried the gleaming Ethereum crystal from its pommel. With a clench of his fist, the crystal rapidly decayed, turning to dust in his palm. Seeing no one around, he nonchalantly lifted his coat and refilled the empty mug. A steaming new batch of harrowroot tonic was ready. Grabbing a handful of snow, he wiped the blood from his neck, picked up the wooden tray, and proceeded calmly toward the residence of the lady of the house. A woman's wails, crying out for her son who was gone so suddenly, drifted from behind the thick cotton drapes, blending with the howling wind. Mr. Ashworth's weary voice could be heard trying to console her, mentioning that the Sterling family had replied and would send someone to investigate. The name Sterling made Leo's hand pause on the curtain. An image of Julian Sterling's flawlessly handsome face surfaced in his mind. He wondered what expression that man would wear upon hearing of his own death. He pushed aside the curtain, and the warmth from the fireplace washed over him, making his frozen body shudder. Mrs. Ashworth had a cloth band tied around her head to ward off drafts. She rested her weary face on one hand. Without her usual makeup, the two faint scars that broke the line of her eyebrows were visible. He remembered his old master, upon first seeing him, remarking that this Mrs. Ashworth, with her broken brows and jagged teeth, was surely a vicious woman. At the time, Leo had been deeply impressed, believing the man to be incredibly perceptive, and had left with him without a second thought. Seeing those broken brows again after so many years, he felt an odd sense of familiarity. Mrs. Ashworth gestured for him to leave the tray, too preoccupied to pay him any mind, and continued her discussion with her husband about the Sterlings. Leo stammered that the tonic was getting cold. his voice small and urgent, as a child's would be. Mr. Ashworth, catching the faint ammoniac scent, urged his wife to drink it quickly while it was hot, reminding her it was harrowroot. Only then did Mrs. Ashworth recall the precious medicine she had ordered. She picked it up and drank it in one gulp, letting out a long sigh and rubbing her temples. She murmured that it really did make her feel much better. Leo glanced at the visibly relieved woman before lowering his head once more. He wondered when the people from Stellarmont would arrive. Mr. Ashworth was discussing with his wife the need to postpone their eldest son's burial. Mrs. Ashworth protested that it had already been 3 days, and any further delay would be unseemly. She angrily insisted, through a set of uneven teeth, that they should be told to hurry. The funeral had been held the day before, and the burial should have been today, but the suspicious circumstances of the death had prompted the family to search for clues, causing a day's delay. Now they had to wait for the Sterlings. Mr. Ashworth retorted, his patience wearing thin, that it was absurd. He questioned whether the great lord of Stellarmont was someone he could simply command to hurry. The Ashworths were Hereri Manor lords, under the jurisdiction of the Duke of the North. They held the right to collect taxes and rents from their domain but had no political power. Ultimately, they were vassals of the Sterling family. It was unthinkable for a subordinate to give orders to his master. Stellarmont was the seat of the Sterling family, the very center of the northern domain. The north was cold. It was only mid-September, yet snow was already falling. In the pavilions of Stellarmont, underfloor heating was active. Even a small gazebo by the water was as warm as spring. The attendants and guards moved about in light clothing. Only the young man sitting in the gazebo watching the snow was wrapped in a fox-fur throw. A guard in dark, close-fitting attire approached with a bowl of medicine, knelt on one knee, and said quietly that it was time for the young lord's dose. The young man withdrew his gaze from the snowy landscape but did not take the bowl. He asked if there was any news of Miles Corbin. The guard, holding the bowl steady, replied in a calm, measured tone that the Corbin family had no knowledge of his whereabouts. He had last been seen heading west a year ago, and all contact had been lost since. Julian Sterling slowly pressed his pale lips together. He instructed the guard to continue the search. The guard affirmed the order. He rose and took 2 steps before remembering the bowl in his hands, asking what should be done with the medicine. Julian told him to pour it out. Outside the gazebo stood a lady-in-waiting in a violet dress. Seeing the guard emerge with the medicine untouched, she put her hands on her hips and demanded to know what had happened to the guarantee he had given her. She asked if a single drop had been drunk. The guard's face flushed as he explained that the young lord had ordered it poured out, and he had simply obeyed. The lady-in-waiting scoffed at his lack of initiative. She took the bowl from him, but despite her sharp words, she did not dare to go back in and persuade Julian herself. Instead, she vented her frustration by scolding the guard a little more. After so long, the search still yielded nothing. Julian stood and rested a hand on the low railing of the gazebo. Snowflakes landed on the back of his pale hand, slowly melting into water droplets. The icy touch did little to quell the anxiety burning within him. The last time he had met Leo, the man was already the formidable Lord of the Exiles, a man who rarely spoke of his childhood. Only once, while drunk, had he mentioned it. His family had fallen on hard times when he was a child, and he had fled with a guard to the guard's ancestral home, posing as his son for many years. He remembered the drunken Lord of the Exiles grabbing his collar, asking with a voice caught between a sob and a laugh why Julian hadn't taken him away, because they had all bullied him. At the time, Julian had found it strange, but now, the memory was heart-wrenching. The drunken Leo must have mistaken him for his deceased father, pleading as he must have in his childhood despair for his father to rescue him. Julian had to find Leo as soon as possible, but the kingdom was vast, filled with countless minor families, and he did not even know the name Leo used as a child. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack. His only option was to first find Leo's master, Miles Corbin. But Miles was an elusive character, no easier to find than Leo himself. A lady-in-waiting in a violet dress approached, followed by a young page, informing the young lord that the Duke was looking for him. The ruler of the North, the current Duke Sterling, sat imposingly in the main hall. When his eldest son entered, he handed him a letter. Julian glanced at it. It was a routine death notice from the Ashworth family of Clearwater. Their eldest son had died suddenly, an early and tragic death, and would soon be buried. A family counselor, Mr. Easton, explained that the Ashworth boy's death was suspicious, and the lord of the manor wished for someone from Stellarmont to help find the perpetrator. Hearing the word suspicious, Julian inquired as to the details. The messenger had reported that the boy's corpse was horrifying to behold. Though he had only just died, his body was already in a state of decay. A rite to summon his spirit had yielded no response from any of his 3 souls or 7 spirits. Julian's hand, holding the letter, tightened abruptly. The lady-in-waiting shivered, remarking that Mr. Easton's story was frightening. Mr. Easton had a flair for the dramatic, his speech full of unnecessary pauses and inflections that could make one's skin crawl. The Duke asked his son about a young man he had recently recommended, suggesting he could go with Easton. The Ashworths of Clearwater, as lords of a significant domain, deserved a degree of attention. But Julian stated firmly that he would go himself. The spirit, separate from the physical body, was composed of both soul and psyche. The soul could leave the body, but the psyche could not. Even in death, it was impossible for both soul and psyche to be entirely unresponsive. Leo, standing in Mrs. Ashworth's room listening to the couple argue, thought the same. The timing of the eldest Ashworth's death was wrong, and the manner of it was too strange. He needed to see the body to confirm how this world differed from his previous one. With the burial postponed, Mrs. Ashworth worried about who would keep the vigil that night. Since the eldest son was not yet 15, his death was considered premature, so the funeral could not be a grand affair. At night, only one close relative was to stand watch. The second son had watched for the first 2 nights and was exhausted from the day before, so Mrs. Ashworth had taken the duty herself, only to fall ill after just 1 night. Mr. Ashworth sighed and said they would have to ask Caleb again. He sent someone to inform the second son. However, the messenger returned, reporting that Caleb could not be found. Now both parents were frantic. They only had 2 sons. One had just died, and they could not afford for anything to happen to the other. They immediately dispatched guards on ether blades to search for him. Half an hour later, they found Trent's body and the unconscious Caleb in a secluded area of the woods. Mrs. Ashworth clutched her younger son tightly, checking him from head to toe, crying out his name. A guard described what he had seen, explaining that Trent had been holding Caleb's sword, while the young master held a broken blade, his face covered in blood. Mr. Ashworth ordered a thorough search of the woods, had ether channeled into his son, and summoned a physician. The scene was chaotic. The physician concluded that Caleb had simply fainted from fright. Given the broken sword in his hand and the blood on his face, it seemed most likely that the 2 had been playing. Trent had taken Caleb's sword, and Caleb had accidentally killed him, then fainted at the sight of the gushing blood. Though some parts of the story did not add up, there was no one else in the woods besides a few mundane servants, and Caleb had only minor scratches. Mrs. Ashworth immediately demanded the matter be hushed up. She declared that Trent had died from a training accident and that it had nothing to do with Caleb, ordering everyone to remember that. A house guard was an ether wielder and could not be killed without consequence. Caleb was carried back to his room, and the matter was closed. But this left no one for the night's vigil. At a loss, Mr. Ashworth turned and saw his timid nephew standing in the corner. He told Leo that he would keep watch for his older brother that night. Leo's eyes, like those of a young deer, widened. He pleaded with his uncle, saying he was scared. Mrs. Ashworth, already on edge, slapped him across the face. She spat that he was a little bastard and had no right to be afraid of keeping vigil for his cousin. The slap stung, and tears immediately welled in Leo's eyes. He meekly agreed. Mr. Ashworth, seeing his state, frowned slightly. He instructed the butler to find Leo a decent set of clothes. It would be shameful if the people from Stellarmont arrived early in the morning and saw the person keeping vigil dressed like a beggar. Leo was changed into a plain white cotton robe, a thin hemp cord tied around his forehead. At dusk, he was led to the morning hall to kneel. The hall was empty and eerie. The eldest Ashworth son lay in an unsealed coffin, a yellow warding seal stuck to his face. It was clear the family was afraid of the spirit that had not responded to their summons. Leo curled up on a cushion and slept soundly. When the moon was high in the sky, he finally stirred. He broke off a piece of a white candle and, with some effort, hoisted his short legs over the edge of the coffin. He sat on the rim and studied the deceased. He mused aloud, asking Arthur Ashworth why he had died so soon, and who he was supposed to take his revenge on now for his broken arm. With that, he peeled the yellow paper from the dead boy's face and poked it. The sticky, decomposing texture sent a shiver of revulsion through him. He brought the candlelight closer. The once unremarkable face was no longer recognizable as a face at all. After death, the soul returns to the heavens and the psyche to the earth. The soul is spirit, the psyche is form. For the body to decay so rapidly, the psyche must be gone. He jumped down from the coffin and searched the hall, finally finding a mirror in a corner. It was a brass mirror with an old elmwood base, its surface covered with white paper and placed face down on a table. It was a burial good, piled together with other miscellaneous trinkets. He quickly tore off the paper, and the mirror immediately reflected a small, pale face. He jumped in surprise. He hadn't even drawn a sigil yet. How could a ghost have appeared? A closer look revealed it was his own face. He hadn't seen his childhood face in over a decade and was momentarily unfamiliar with it. Having missed dinner and being thinly dressed in the drafty hall, it was no wonder he looked so pale. He rubbed his nose, amused at himself. The child in the mirror had eyes that were deeper than those of most children. When he smiled, a faint resemblance to his future self could be seen. A shame, he thought, that he didn't have the Sterling family's distinctive upturned eyes, but rather the look of a wolf cub, mimicking the tone the family patriarch had once used to describe him. He sighed with mock gravity, bit his finger, and quickly drew a sigil on the back of the mirror. As the last stroke was completed, the mirror flared with a brilliant light. Moments later, it transformed from a mundane mirror to a scrying glass. In a normal mirror, words appear reversed, a mirror image. In a scrying glass, a tool of power, words appear correctly, as if reality itself were transposed into the glass. The character for offering in the center of the hall now appeared correctly in the old elmwood mirror. He grabbed a piece of fruit from the altar and began to eat, holding the mirror as he walked around the hall. A scrying glass does not reflect the living but the souls of the dead. Soon, he saw the spirit of a pretty young girl who looked like one of the eldest son's maids, Winter. After death, if not preserved by special means, a soul can only linger in the mortal world for 7 days. This meant Winter had died within the last week, likely a victim of the lady's anger after her son's sudden death. The lives of common folk were cheap, easily extinguished. Leo sighed, finished his fruit, and burned a handful of paper money for her. Walking further, he saw Trent, drifting aimlessly with a lost expression. Leo clicked his tongue in regret. Trent had been a promising talent. He would have made good fuel for a spirit weapon, but unfortunately, Leo currently possessed no weapon worth refining. He circled the morning hall, seeing several familiar faces, but not the eldest son. Could he truly have been soul-shattered? Tossing the mirror aside, Leo climbed back onto the coffin and replaced the yellow paper on the deceased's face. This state was identical to when he had crushed the boy's soul himself in his past life. But the soul-crushing technique was something he had developed at 17. Who else would know it at this time? Could some ancient soul-devouring creature have appeared in the world? He raised a hand to scratch his head, then remembered he had just touched the dead boy's face and abandoned the idea. He fumbled inside the coffin for a moment and pulled a yellow jade pendant from the corpse's waist. It was the one the eldest son had taken from him when he first arrived at the Ashworth estate. The cool, smooth yellow jade was carved in the shape of a deer looking back. It was the last gift his father had given him, his only keepsake. He tore off the gaudy silk cord, found a basin of clean water to wash it, then took a strand of the thin hemp cord from his forehead and tied the pendant around his own neck. He had not yet mourned his father properly since his death. The hemp cord would serve as a token of his grief. He remembered his father's words, his resolute face, telling him to go with Aaron Ashworth, that he would find him later. The man had pressed the pendant into his young son's hand, his usually amorous, upturned eyes full of sorrow. He had cried then, not wanting to leave his father. Aaron, the guard, had tried to soothe him, saying they would go to his brother's domain at Clearwater to rest for a while. He had begged Aaron to wake up, not understanding. Perhaps it was because of his small body, but memories that had long since faded were now returning with painful clarity. When he was shaken awake, he was for a moment unsure of how old he was. A voice hissed at him not to sleep, to kneel properly, that the people from Stellarmont were about to arrive. Just as dawn was breaking, the steward entered with a group of servants in mourning clothes, cleaning and rearranging the hall. Leo rubbed his eyes and grumbled, asking if they hadn't known yesterday. The steward's face was a mixture of excitement and anxiety, so complex it was contorted. He exclaimed that yesterday they had no idea the young lord himself would be coming. The title, Young Lord, struck Leo like a small bolt of lightning, freezing him in place. He asked if it was the young lord of Stellarmont. The steward, with an air of someone who expected to be noticed and promoted at any moment, confirmed that there was no other. He then began to list the young lord's accolades: the legitimate firstborn son of the Duke, a once-in-a-generation genius, though frail and sickly from a young age. Frail and sickly? Hearing a description so utterly at odds with the Julian Sterling he knew, Leo felt a flicker of uncertainty. The man he remembered had a constitution as robust as an ox, known from a young age for his prodigious strength. Could the young lord not be Julian? And if so, where was Julian? Julian was in a speeding motorcade. His counselor, Mr. Easton, rode ahead in a separate vehicle, his face grimacing as he endured the wind and snow. He spoke into his comms, complaining that the Ashworths had said they would postpone the burial, so there was no need for them to travel through the night. From the lead car, a vehicle stabilized by 16 Ethereum gyroscopes that made it glide as if on air, a young man's calm and resolute voice replied, telling them to continue at speed. "Rebuffed, Mr." Easton muttered quietly to the impassive guard beside him, a man named Garrett, asking why the young lord was in such a hurry. It wasn't as if the dead Ashworth boy was going anywhere. Though also an ether wielder, Easton was a diplomat at Stellarmont and had not endured such arduous travel in a long time. What he thought would be a simple task had turned into a grueling ordeal because of the young lord's involvement. The guard in the dark uniform, the same Garrett who had brought the medicine, replied without turning his head. He informed the counselor that the young lord had long instructed them to be on the lookout for anyone who appeared to have been soul-shattered. After such a long search, a clue had finally emerged. It was only natural for him to be anxious. Even the well-traveled Mr. Easton could not fathom why the young lord was searching for victims of soul-shattering. He could only pull up his windbreaker and urge his driver onward, hoping to arrive sooner and suffer less from the cold. Julian sat in the warm car, holding a silver, filigreed hand warmer, gently tracing the small deer carved on its lid. He had thought everything had already begun, but it seemed he had been reborn 2 years too early. The terrible consequences of the soul-shattering technique were only now beginning to manifest. Would the young Leo be at Clearwater? He hoped this trip to the Ashworths would not be a disappointment. Mr. Ashworth, with his sickly-looking wife, personally greeted them at the gate. Seeing the sleek, silver-trimmed vehicle in the distance, he bowed low. He announced himself as their vassal Aaron Ashworth, welcoming the young lord. One moment the car was 100 yards away, the next it was before them. Stopped smoothly. A guard disembarked and opened the door. A young man in a dark, wide-sleeved, elegant suit stepped out. A lady-in-waiting immediately draped a heavy fur-lined coat over his shoulders. The young man was exceptionally handsome, with a refined, almost severe grace, like a star in the heavens. His posture was as elegant as a pine tree in the wind. To see him once was to never forget. To look at him for too long was to feel a sense of awe. Mr. Ashworth had seen the young lord 2 years prior during the annual tribute. At that time, Julian, though proud and aloof, was nothing like the intimidating figure before him now. He wondered what divine power the young lord had mastered in 2 years to have an aura more formidable than his own father's. Julian walked without stopping, giving a slight gesture for them to rise, and headed straight for the morning hall. The servants, who had not finished their preparations, quickly scattered, leaving only 2 ether-wielding guards and the mourner, Leo, kneeling on a cushion. As Julian entered the hall, his eyes immediately fell on the small child in plain white. When their gazes met, he saw those unmistakable, deep blue eyes, and the anxiety that had plagued him throughout the journey instantly settled. Mrs. Ashworth, supported by a maid, approached, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and pleading for the young lord to find justice for her ill-fated son. Their eyes met for only a fleeting moment. Leo didn't even notice the young lord giving him a second glance. He himself, however, felt no need for discretion. Once the young man looked away, Leo's gaze lingered, almost greedily tracing his form. The young Julian Sterling was truly beautiful, with the unique lean grace of adolescence, like a tender lotus root washed in a clear stream under a bright sun, tempting one to take a bite. Julian offered a stick of incense for the deceased. Due to his status, he did not need to bow, but Leo, as a filial mourner, had to return the gesture. The small child, raising his short arms, bowed with solemn formality, a sight that was strangely endearing. Even a ferocious wolf is but a fluffy cub in its youth, and Leo was already a handsome child. Mr. Easton stroked his mustache and praised the boy, noting his sharp features and graceful bearing. He predicted the young gentleman would achieve great things and asked if he was the family's second son. A sudden silence fell over the hall. Mrs. Ashworth's expression soured. Mr. Ashworth, however, remained composed, explaining with a polite smile that the boy was his late brother's son. He did not even mention Leo's name before inviting the visitors to inspect the body. Julian, showing no interest in the deceased now, gestured for Mr. Easton to open the coffin. Easton was stunned to see the young lord casually beckon the child to his side, acting as if the entire matter was of no concern to him. He suddenly felt the urge to compose a poem. Through snowy mountains and across frozen plains, for what reason did the young lord travel day and night? But poetry would not save him from the task at hand. The resigned Mr. Easton had no choice but to steel himself for his meeting with the late Arthur Ashworth. Leo had been watching Julian's every move. When he saw him beckon, he quickly trotted over, making way for the men opening the coffin. Julian looked down at him. He himself was still just a youth, only a head taller than Leo. He asked the boy his name. Leo replied that his name was Leo. He seemed shy, lowering his head and fidgeting with his fingers. While Julian wasn't looking, he stealthily brushed his hand against the back of Julian's, which hung by his side. A soft, warm touch grazed his skin, like the lick of a puppy. Julian's fingertips twitched involuntarily. Assuming it was just a child's curiosity, and not wanting to startle him, he feigned ignorance. The inspection of the body took some time. Mr. Easton's conclusion was similar to Leo's. Lacking knowledge of a technique that could shatter a soul, he speculated that they were dealing with some kind of spirit-devouring creature or monster. He recounted a strange incident from 6 months prior in the Great Wilds. A family had just welcomed a new bride, only for everyone to die overnight. The bride was the sole survivor, but she was left in a state of shock, with no memory of what had happened. Stellarmont had sent investigators and found the family had died in a horrific manner. He spoke like a storyteller, drawing his audience in. Mr. Ashworth, impatient to know the cause of his son's death, asked if their bodies were destroyed like his son's. Easton shook his head, explaining that their souls were gone, but their bodies were intact. Seeing the Ashworth's lack of appreciation for his narrative flair, he cut to the chase, stating that their investigation had found traces of a soul-eater griffin near the Great Wilds. Julian listened with a placid expression, making no comment. He knew of the incident. The family had only lost their souls. Their psyches remained. The horrific state of the bodies had been caused by the bride, who had been taken by force and, out of resentment, had mutilated the corpses after their deaths. The words soul-eater griffin caused a stir of panic among the Ashworths. It was a famous monster from the bestiaries, described as a creature like an eagle with claws and horns that entered homes at night to devour living souls. Legend had it that a century ago, it had caused mass deaths, prompting the kingdom to order a great hunt. The ether-wielding families had mobilized and supposedly eradicated the creature. To think it had reappeared and in their own home. Just then, a servant reported that the second son was awake. Caleb had been unconscious for a day and a night, and the physicians could find no cause. Now that he was finally awake, Mrs. Ashworth could not sit still. She excused herself and rushed to the rear courtyard to see her son. Leo quietly told Mr. Ashworth that he also wanted to see the young master. Though he was technically a master of the house, he referred to his cousin as young master. The visitors from Stellarmont found this odd. But the Ashworths, accustomed to it, saw nothing wrong. Mr. Ashworth, striving to maintain the image of a benevolent uncle in front of his guests, replied kindly that Leo was thoughtful and told him to go. Having received his uncle's permission, Leo then looked questioningly at Julian. The Lord of the Exiles had never needed anyone's permission for anything, not even the Emperor's. When had he ever been so docile? Julian's heart softened at the sight. He gave a slight nod, indicating Leo was free to go. Julian Sterling certainly liked obedient people, Leo thought with a smirk as he ran out of the morning hall. In his past life, Julian had never given him a pleasant look, clearly disapproving of his rebellious nature. Now that he had met Julian unexpectedly early, he was determined to leave a good impression. He rubbed his fingers together, savoring the memory of the touch. The young man's hand was as cool and smooth as jade. He wondered if calluses had yet formed at the base of his fingers. It would be even better if he could get a feel of his. Upon entering Caleb's courtyard, Leo immediately wiped the slightly lewd smile from his face, hunched his shoulders, and stood close to the wall beneath the bedroom window, trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. Mrs. Ashworth was in tears, seeing her younger son sitting dazedly on the edge of the bed. She asked if Trent had harmed him. Caleb looked blank, with no memory of how he had fainted. He couldn't even recall many past events, and thinking too hard gave him a headache. He hadn't turned into a complete imbecile, Leo noted with a click of his tongue. His own power was still too weak. The ensuing scene of maternal affection held no interest for him. Leo strolled away, hands behind his back, and wandered into Mrs. Ashworth's courtyard. Though he was happy to see Julian, beauty could not be a substitute for survival. His most pressing goal was to leave the Ashworth estate as soon as possible and find his unreliable master. The staff in Mrs. Ashworth's courtyard were used to his presence and harbored no suspicion toward the timid and useless third son. Only Mrs. Ashworth's head maid, Spring, was in the room. Leo, with wide, innocent eyes, held out his hand to her, stating that the lady had sent him to fetch 10 gold pieces. Spring asked suspiciously what the gold was for. He explained in a jumbled, childlike manner that it was for Mr. Easton, that his mistress had mentioned something about Stellarmont and wanting the second son to go there as well. The words were disjointed, but Spring understood the gist. It was a bribe for the young lord's attendant, to persuade him to put in a good word so Caleb could accompany the young lord to Stellarmont. Believing she had understood, Spring immediately opened a chest and gave him a small bag containing 10 ounces of gold fragments. The eldest son's unnatural death and the second son's temporary memory loss mirrored the incident in the Great Wilds, further confirming Mr. Easton's theory. Julian, having no desire to prolong the matter, declared that the young master should be laid to rest. He left the morning hall, effectively closing the case and attributing the death to a soul-eater griffin. With the investigation concluded, the party from Stellarmont prepared to leave. Mr. Ashworth, terrified at the thought of a soul-eater griffin lurking on his estate, begged the young lord to stay another day so Stellarmont's experts could help search for the creature. He implored that if the young lord left without even sharing a meal after coming all this way, he would never be able to face the Duke again. As he spoke, bowing deeply, he felt a gaze settle upon him. A gaze that seemed to see right through him, and his heart pounded. After a long silence, just as Mr. Ashworth thought the young lord was about to lose his temper, Julian uttered a single word of agreement and instructed Garrett to lead a search of the grounds. Mr. Ashworth was overjoyed and immediately led the young lord to the most lavishly decorated sunroom. Within the northern domain, everything belonged to the Sterlings. Families like the Ashworths, with their modest etheric abilities and reliance on ancestral prestige, were entirely dependent on Stellarmon's favor. It was an occasion that called for his son to be present. So, despite Caleb's still-dazed state, Mrs. Ashworth had him dressed and dragged him before the young lord, under the pretext of joining him for a meal. The lady-in-waiting in the violet dress stood guard at the sunroom door, informing them haughtily that the young lord preferred quiet and should not be disturbed. This was Iris, who, like the guard Garrett, was one of Julian's personal attendants, an ether wielder from Stellarmont. A gilded, cloud-patterned sword hung at her waist, its pommel set with a brilliant Ethereum crystal. Her every movement was suffused with power. She was clearly not someone to be trifled with. Julian looked at Caleb's eyes, the typical wide, vacant stare of the Ashworths, and grew impatient. He said coldly for them to bring Leo. Leo, with a bag of gold in his pocket, was about to climb over a wall to escape when he was unceremoniously brought before Julian. The meddling Mrs. Ashworth and Caleb were sent away by Mr. Ashworth. Julian asked why he looked so disheveled. The clean white robe from the previous day was now covered in mud, and the hemp cord from his forehead was gone. The neat little gentleman from the morning had reverted to a beggar boy. Hearing this, Leo knew that Julian's useless sense of righteousness was acting up again. The man was decisive on the battlefield, a commander of armies, yet he could never shake his compassion for the weak. This was Julian's weakness, and the only thing that could be used against him. Leo looked up, his bright eyes like black pearls gazing up pitifully. He claimed he had gone to the kitchen for food and had slipped and fallen. As expected, Julian's brow furrowed at the explanation, a sharp pang of sympathy piercing his heart. The boy hadn't even had enough to eat in his childhood. He gestured for Leo to sit beside him and offered him a piece of cake. Leo's hands were dirty, so he couldn't take it himself. He kept his hands behind his back and opened his mouth obediently, finishing the cake in 2 bites. Because he ate so quickly, his cheeks puffed out like a squirrel stuffed with nuts. Julian felt an itch in his fingertips again. He cleared his throat and looked up at Mr. Ashworth, declaring his intention to take the boy as his personal attendant, and asked if the lord of the manor was willing. Personal attendant, not a page. A page could be a commoner, but an attendant was a subordinate, a confidant to the young lord. With hard work and diligent training, a future as a high-ranking official was not out of the question. Mr. Ashworth dared not object. He said it was Leo's great fortune to be noticed by the young lord. Hearing this, however, Leo's heart sank. He was just a powerless child. Julian hadn't even tested his aptitude. Why would he so readily offer him the position of an attendant? Could he already know that he was the son of Leon Croy? He lowered his eyes in thought, his gaze catching the silver pine tree pattern on Julian's dark sleeve. He suddenly recalled the Sterling family motto, "Stand firm as a pine in the snow," and felt a sense of relief. Given the character of Julian and his father, even if they knew he was Leon Croy's son, they would likely do him no harm. Stellarmont's experts scoured the Ashworth estate, from the front yard to the backwoods, but found no trace of a soul-eater griffin. Mr. Ashworth could not press them to stay any longer. The next day, after the eldest son's burial, he expressed his profound gratitude and saw the young lord's party off. And Leo, still in his mourning clothes, was lifted into the young lord's car by Garrett. Leaning against the window, watching the Ashworth estate recede into the distance, Leo felt a sense of unease. Once he entered Stellarmont, leaving would be difficult. Would his master still be able to find him? In his past life, His master had tracked him down by investigating his father's former subordinates one by one. Now that he had left the Ashworths without actively seeking him out, their meeting would be much harder to arrange. Julian looked up from his book, asking if he was sad to leave. He had one knee bent, supporting the arm holding the book, and watched Leo with a calm, appraising gaze. Leo let the curtain fall and shook his head slightly. Julian then asked why he looked so unhappy. He was not usually a talkative person, but faced with this soft, living version of Leo, he couldn't resist speaking to him more. Every question he asked received a response, and no matter what Leo said, it brought him a sense of joy. Leo, as if startled, knelt rigidly on the soft cushion, twisting the hem of his robe. He stammered that he was afraid. The soft, sweet voice, trembling with anxiety, made Julian's heart ache. He told himself not to frighten the child and beckoned for him to come closer. He assured him there was nothing to fear and offered to teach him to read. The car was fitted with Ethereum gyroscopes, making it glide so smoothly one could read and write inside. Leo moved closer to Julian and saw that the book on the small table was an atlas of the kingdom, detailing the geography and customs of its various regions. Julian explained that the kingdom they were in was called Ethelgard, divided into 4 domains: north, south, east, and west, and a central heartland. Both Stellarmont and the Ashworth estate were in the north. He tried to talk about things that would interest a child to capture his attention. Leo, dutifully playing the part of an ignorant child, asked if Stellarmont was a sea. Julian explained that it was not, but rather a network of streams and lakes. He pointed to a spot on the map, then added after a moment's thought that there was a lot of water. Clear streams and deep lakes crisscrossed the land, with pavilions and residences everywhere. It was said that in winter, the lakes froze over, and the reflection of the starry sky was so clear it was as if the galaxy had been washed, hence the name Stellarmont. Such a beautiful scene, when described by Julian, was reduced to a lot of water. Leo fought the urge to laugh at him. Taking advantage of a turn in the road, he leaned closer to Julian. A faint scent of herbs and something clean, like fresh-cut grass, wafted over him. He tilted his head back, sniffing the air like a small animal, and asked the young lord if he was taking medicine. Julian affirmed with a simple hum. Looking at Leo so close, he couldn't resist wrapping an arm gently around him, holding the book for him to see. Leo pressed on, asking why he had to take medicine. Julian, with a perfectly straight face, lied to the child, saying it was a punishment for something he had done wrong. He tapped the page with his finger and said that was why Leo had to pay close attention to what he was teaching, or else. Leo asked if he would have to drink medicine too. A slight upward tilt to the end of Julian's yes revealed his good mood. Unable to get any more information, Leo had to content himself with listening to Julian read. The Sterling family of the north, the Valerius family of the west, the Corbin family of the south, and the Croy family of the east. Besides these 4 great dukes, Ethelgard had over a dozen marquises who governed their own fiefdoms and paid an annual tribute. As Julian was explaining about the Sterling family, he felt a sudden weight against him. He looked down to see that the one who had just promised to listen carefully had fallen asleep against his chest. With a helpless smile, Julian set the book aside and relaxed against the cushions, feigning sleep himself. His thoughts, however, drifted from the book to the state of the kingdom. The tribute laws had not yet been enacted, and the 4 domains were still at peace, but chaos could erupt at any moment. He needed to prepare. Leo, barely able to keep his eyes open, mumbled a question about what tribute was. Gold, silver, grain, cloth, and Ethereum. The young man's low voice was like a young eagle soaring through a snowstorm, cutting through the fog of sleep, but pulling him into a deeper, more distant dream. At 17, he had first set foot in Stellarmont. The early winter sun filtered through the pine forest, fog shrouding the pavilions, snow covering the ferry crossings. It was a place as soft as a dream, yet inhabited by a group of people with faces as cold as iron. All the Sterlings wore dark, wide-sleeved robes. From a distance, they looked like a flock of hunting falcons, ready to swoop down and tear a person to shreds. The Duke, before even exchanging pleasantries, had thrown his reputation to the ground and stomped on it, declaring that the Lord of the Exiles was so young yet so vicious, not even sparing his own mentor. Leo had retorted with a sneer, asking if the Duke had only just heard of something that had happened 2 years ago. He pushed open the clasp of his scabbard with his thumb, his killing intent flaring. Of all things to bring up, they had to mention his master. The world knew that Leo Croy was a ruthless, heartless monster who had killed his own master. Some said he was not even human, but a demon of deceit and bloodlust. He snapped his eyes open. The bloody mist dispersed, leaving only the indigo-blue roof of the car and the scent of sandalwood. A chorus of respectful greetings came from outside. The sound of flowing water and rustling pines filled the air. They had arrived at Stellarmont. Leo scrambled up and lifted the curtain to see Julian standing before the car, exchanging greetings with several dark-robed ether wielders. A young girl with a hunting bow set with Ethereum in her hand called out to her big brother, asking if he was going deer hunting. Julian told them to go on ahead. He reached out and patted the girl's head, then turned back to the car and pulled the nosy Leo back inside. Leo asked if that was his sister. He wasn't sure. Many in the Sterling family could call Julian Big Brother, but he wondered if it was the famous Lady Sylvia Sterling. Julian, seeing the child craning his neck to look outside, frowned slightly. He confirmed that her name was Sylvie. It was her. Sylvie Sterling, known by her formal name Sylvia upon her coming of age, was born with immense strength, able to draw a bow that could shatter stone, the greatest archer in Ethelgard. The memory of her arrow piercing his bone was still fresh. Leo scratched his chest. Just knowing it was her made his chest ache with a phantom pain. He asked what he should call her. Julian interrupted him harshly, telling him to stay away from her. Seeing Leo's surprised expression, he thought he had frightened him and softened his tone. He explained that she had a bad temper and that he shouldn't play with her. Now Leo was even more confused. Hadn't Julian always cherished this sister? Why would he speak ill of her to someone who had just met her, saying she had a bad temper? Could the young Sylvia have been so unbearable that even Julian found her annoying? Stellarmont was vast. The car continued for some time before reaching the young lord's residence, Maple Crossing. There was water everywhere and crossings everywhere. The residences at Stellarmont were all named after crossings. The young lord's residence had several century-old maple trees with towering canopies. It was autumn, and the ground was covered in red maple leaves, dyeing the nearby water a crimson hue. It was a beautiful sight. Several mundane servants were cleaning the courtyard. They bowed upon seeing the young lord return. Besides Julian, the only ether wielders at Maple Crossing were the guard Garrett and the lady-in-waiting Iris. Julian left Leo in Iris's care and departed with Mr. Easton. Leo stood uncertainly in the courtyard, staring at Iris. She informed him with a sharp tone that upon returning, the young lord must first report to his father, and that if it weren't for him, he would have gone directly. Leo was not intimidated by the young woman. He nodded obediently, picked up a broom taller than himself, and began sweeping leaves with the other servants. Iris, after a moment's hesitation, stopped him. She uncrossed her arms from her customary position on her hips, bent down, and asked if his name was Leo. She introduced herself as Iris and started to explain his duties. Leo looked up at her and smiled, his eyes crinkling. He asked if he could call her Iris. He was a handsome child, and having slept well in the car, he looked as fresh and plump as a well-watered radish, utterly endearing. Iris found her intended lecture stuck in her throat. She agreed, of course, that he could. Her tone softened as she took his small hand, tossing the broom aside. She told him he was an attendant, not a servant, and was not required to do any menial chores in the courtyard. With that, she began rummaging through chests to find him some clothes. Leo asked what he was supposed to do then, pulling at his own clothes, his eyes darkening slightly. The clothes she pulled from the chest, brocade robes and jade belts, were clearly Julian's from his childhood. This attendant was dressing him in the young lord's own clothes. He wasn't sure if it was because the rules at Stellarmont were particularly relaxed, or if there was another reason. After changing out of his morning clothes and into the fine robes, the pitiful little boy was transformed into a young nobleman. Iris was quite pleased with the result. She emerged from behind the screen, poked his smooth forehead with a finger, and said that there would certainly be use for him. Once he was presentable, Iris took him to eat. They had been traveling all day, and it was now dusk. Garrett had gone with the young lord to see the Duke, so only Iris and Leo were dining at Maple Crossing. Iris, between bites of food, gave him a brief overview of the rules at Stellarmont. She explained that the young lord had a cold temperament and should not be bothered without reason. There was one thing, she stressed, that he must remember. When the young lord slept, a candle must be kept lit all night and never be extinguished. If he were to enter the inner chamber at night, he must not, under any circumstances, put out the candle. Leo asked why, a suspicious look on his face. In his past life, he had slept with Julian and had never known him to have such a strange habit of sleeping with a candle lit. He asked if the young lord was afraid of the dark. Iris shushed him, stuffing a piece of roast pork into his mouth and telling him not to ask questions that were not his concern. So, he really was afraid of the dark. Leo chewed on the pork, a feeling of disbelief washing over him. Julian had no idea that his image was being tarnished by his well-meaning attendant. He entered the main hall to report to his father, only to find him in pleasant conversation with a cultivator in white. The man was dressed in a simple, close-fitting tunic with a collar of white tiger fur, the attire of the Valerius family from the west. Upon seeing Julian, the cultivator immediately stood and bowed. Julian returned the gesture. The man's face was unfamiliar. He had no memory of him from either life. He must not be anyone of importance. He turned his attention to his father. His father explained with a smile that this was a messenger from the Valerius family. His old friend, Lord Valerius, had invited him for a drink. He had been close friends with Marcus Valerius since childhood and always referred to him as your Uncle Marcus when speaking to Julian. The messenger elaborated that the century-old vintage at Mount Moriah was to be opened, and the Duke was specially invited to taste it. Duke Sterling readily accepted his old friend's invitation. Julian, however, sensed something amiss. He distinctly remembered that the century-old vintage at Mount Moriah was not opened until Sylvie's coming-of-age ceremony. He interjected that he wished to go as well, stating that it had been a long time since he had seen Victor and Vincent. Victor and Vincent Valerius were the twin sons of the family head, Marcus, and they visited Stellarmont almost every year. His father readily agreed. After dining with his father at Jade Crossing, Julian returned to Maple Crossing with a heavy heart. As he reached the end of a covered walkway, he stopped abruptly. Garrett, following behind, asked what was wrong. Julian instructed him to investigate the Valerius messenger and find out whose man he truly was. He stood in the dim light, his eyes dark and unreadable. Garrett understood and bowed before departing. After dinner, Leo declined Iris's offer of a tour and sat obediently on the rug in the inner chamber, watching the door like a puppy waiting for its master to return. Iris shook her head with a helpless smile, told him not to touch anything in the room, and left. The moment she was gone, Leo somersaulted like a monkey and began exploring the inner chamber. This was the place where Julian had grown up. To him, it was full of wonders. The north was cold, and the room was heated from below, allowing one to walk barefoot. A cool incense burner on a low table filled the air with a quiet, distant fragrance, tinged with the fresh scent of plants. Books were neatly arranged on shelves. A long sword hung on the wall. He searched every corner but found no marbles or puzzles. None of the things a child should have. Was the man truly so dull, even as a child? Leo pouted, jumped onto the large bed that smelled of fresh plants, and rolled around. He giggled to himself, thinking that he, Julian Sterling, was sleeping in his bed. Hearing footsteps outside, Leo scrambled off the bed, landing in a perfect crouch. When Julian entered the room, he saw the small child sitting cross-legged in the middle of the rug, his wide, dark eyes looking up at him. Leo's eyes were actually a deep blue, a color not easily discernible unless one was very close, a swirling night sky blue. But Julian had seen them up close and could recognize them instantly. The weight on his heart lifted the moment he met those eyes. He walked over and pulled the boy up from the floor, asking why he was sitting on the ground. Leo, with his head down, wiggled his bare toes on the rug. He said he was waiting, that he didn't know what to do, and Iris had told him Julian would tell him. Julian took a deep breath. He asked if Leo knew what an attendant's duties were. Leo shook his head blankly. After a long moment of seeming consideration, Julian clasped his hands behind his back, mimicking Leo's childish posture, and lifted his chin slightly. He stated that the weather was cold, and Leo's job was to warm his bed. With that, he turned to go bathe, adding after a few steps that it was an attendant's duty. Leo spat silently. Afraid of the dark was afraid of the dark. What nonsense was this, trying to fool him as if he were an ignorant child? Outwardly, however, he looked confused and asked if Iris had ever warmed the bed. Julian cleared his throat and said she had not, as she was a girl, before disappearing into the washroom. Leo was satisfied with the answer. He quickly removed his outer robe, washed his hands and feet in a basin of water, and obediently crawled into the bed. When Julian emerged from his bath, he saw a small lump under the brocade quilt. A pair of small, pale hands held the edge of the quilt, revealing only two bright, sparkling eyes. A muffled voice said that the young lord, it was very warm now, could come in. The barefooted young lord stumbled, his left foot stepping on his right. An image from his past life suddenly flashed before him, a memory of a few reckless nights. The 20-something Leo, his eyes smiling, had looked at him and said that it was very warm inside. Didn't he want to come in? Now, the equally young Julian awkwardly climbed into bed, slid under the covers, and with a flick of his fingers, extinguished the candle. Leo, feigning surprise, scooted over to Julian's pillow, remarking that Iris had said the candle must not be extinguished. Julian told him it was all right. With him there was no need for a light. He tucked the quilt around Leo, making no move to correct the attendant for encroaching on his space. So, he really was afraid of the dark, and having someone to sleep with made him brave. Leo wiggled his feet under the covers triumphantly. Discovering Julian Sterling's weaknesses always brought him pleasure. In the moonlight, he gazed at Julian's closed eyes with an almost fatherly affection, silently telling him not to be afraid, that his big brother would take care of him. At midnight, Julian's eyes snapped open. The room was pitch black. A cold sweat instantly soaked his nightshirt. He started to sit up but was stopped by a soft, warm hand. The part of his soul that had been scattered to the 9 heavens came rushing back to his body. The young Leo was a restless sleeper and had at some point moved completely onto Julian's pillow, pressing tightly against him. After his eyes adjusted to the darkness, his surroundings slowly came into focus. Julian turned on his side and, by the light of the moon, gazed at the sleeping child, tracing his features with his eyes. The young Leo was so soft and obedient. He was fortunate to have found him so early, before everything had happened. He recalled their first meeting in his past life. The 16-year-old Leo had already been molded by his harsh childhood into the person he was. It was the royal hunt at Clearwater Preserve. For Julian, who had been participating since he was 8, it held no novelty, so he had arrived 2 days late. A sharp cry of "on guard" came from his side. Drawing his sword, Julian parried the attack from above without even turning his head. A voice from the air exclaimed in disbelief that he had managed to block that. Victor Valerius twisted in midair, his feet tapping against a tree trunk as he leaped onto a high branch, calling for his brother to save him. At his cry, a young man who looked identical to him appeared from behind, using his sword tip to deflect the blade about to strike his brother's rear. Both he and Julian landed on the ground, the newcomer looking at him silently. Julian sheathed his sword. Victor jumped down from the tree and threw an arm around his neck, complaining about how long it had taken him to arrive. He lamented that he had been stuck with his brother Vincent's boring face for 2 days and was about to die of boredom. Julian cast a sidelong glance at him, reminding him that he and Vincent had the same face. Victor insisted that he was clearly more handsome. The stoic Vincent followed them silently, offering no rebuttal. As the 3 of them walked toward the center of the hunting grounds, Victor, after boasting of his own heroic exploits, brought up a recent piece of news. He asked if Julian had seen the grim figure standing beside the king. The newly appointed Lord of the Exiles, only 16 years old. On the royal platform, a young man in a close-fitting, embroidered blue tunic, with a crescent-shaped blade at his waist, felt someone watching him and turned his gaze in their direction. Those eyes, full of ferocity, made Julian's heart skip a beat. He asked if that was Leon Croy's son. Victor confirmed it, and since his friend knew Leo's identity, he went straight to the point. He said the boy had personally killed the master who had raised him, a truly ruthless act. He pointed out the crescent blade at his waist, a gift from the king, the demonic blade soul drinker. He added with a sneer that only someone who would kill his own master could control soul drinker's evil energy. Most of the noble youths who had not yet come of age participated in the hunt at Clearwater, gathering in groups based on their family's connections. Yet, no matter the group, everyone kept a clear distance from Leo. They whispered that he was not to be provoked, that he was currently in the king's favor. The day before, he had used that blade to sever the hand of the Marquis of Crestwood's second son, and the matter had been dropped without consequence. Victor rubbed his wrist nervously and pulled Julian away. Later during the hunt, Vincent managed to take down a rare white tiger. Before he could retrieve it, Leo appeared out of nowhere and claimed it. Vincent, his lips pressed into a thin line, demanded it back. Leo, mounted on a tall horse, sneered that a white tiger was bad luck. His followers quickly tied up the animal and loaded it onto their own cart. He added that they should take the white-furred beast back, skin it, and dye it black. The Valerius brothers, both dressed in white, paled. Victor couldn't help but shout, asking who the hell he was calling a beast. Leo glanced at them lazily and said that whoever answered was. Vincent dismounted, drew his sword, and challenged Leo to a fight. Victor quickly tried to stop his brother, but it was too late. Leo didn't even bother to accept the challenge. He simply drew his blade and charged. The demonic blade Soul Drinker, imbued with ancient malevolent energy, moved like a phantom, twisting around Vincent's long sword. Before Victor could even process what was happening, Soul Drinker had hooked around his brother's neck. The 3 high-grade Ethereum crystals on its hilt pulsed, and a vast amount of energy flowed along the curved blade, encircling Vincent's entire head. Leo, casually twirling the blade, remarked that he had a question for the young lord. The overflowing energy sliced through the fabric on Vincent's shoulder. Victor, watching Leo's hand anxiously, asked what he wanted, terrified that a slight twitch would behead his brother. Leo asked with a look of innocent curiosity if the necks of the Valerius family were any different from others, if perhaps they were particularly tough. Victor was so enraged he could barely breathe. A blinding flash of sword light cut through the air, precisely meeting the edge of Soul Drinker. Leo felt his crescent blade being pulled aside as if by a magnet. The blade was too sharp. To avoid hurting Vincent, Julian had to lock it in place. Leo let go of the younger Valerius and turned his blade on the meddling Julian, only to be trapped by the follow-through of Julian's previous move. In a moment of carelessness, Julian's long sword slipped through the curve of his blade. With a flick and a twist, Leo found himself pinned in Julian's arms. Leo praised his swordsmanship, then suddenly exerted force with his crescent blade, but Julian, anticipating the move, pressed it down again. Leo turned his head and looked at Julian carefully, asking who he was. Julian stated his name. Leo sheathed his blade and said that he would remember him. For the Lord of the Exiles, the words "I'll remember you" were never an idle threat. Recounting their years of entanglement, Julian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He watched the boy sleeping on his pillow for a while longer, then secretly moved him closer into his arms. In the morning, Leo opened his eyes to find he had somehow rolled into Julian's embrace. He greedily inhaled the faint, clean scent of herbs, a scent that could pull him from his deepest nightmares. Holding his breath, he listened to Julian's breathing, long and even. He was still sound asleep. Leo lifted his head, touched the young man's smooth, beardless chin with his nose, and opened his mouth, ready to take a bite. The long breaths shortened. Julian opened his eyes to find Leo had completely taken over his side of the bed, sleeping soundly, and was quite pleased. Just then, Leo, seemingly about to wake, nuzzled against his chest, pushing open his nightshirt and pressing his warm cheek against his skin. The young lord sat up. The feigning Leo opened his eyes and stared thoughtfully at the sliver of Julian's waist now exposed. The man's body temperature was noticeably lower than his own, which was unusual for a boy his age. He slowly sat up, rubbed his eyes, and gave an innocent yawn. When Iris entered, she saw the sleepy Leo sitting in the young lord's bed, while their master was already up and dressed in his underclothes. She was about to scold the child for taking such liberties, but her hand, reaching for Leo's ear, accidentally bumped Julian's arm as he was pulling on his outer robe. She quickly changed course and began helping Julian dress instead. Julian, fastening the cuffs of his tunic, quietly instructed Iris to get Leo ready, as he was going with his father to Mount Moriah that day. Iris acknowledged the order, then helped him with his dark, wide-sleeved outer robe. When she turned back to Leo, he was already dressed and holding up a wrung-out washcloth for Julian, as if presenting a treasure. Julian took the cloth, cutting off whatever Iris was about to say next by stating that from now on, Leo would sleep here. Iris was surprised to see that the usual pale, sickly cast to the young lord's face upon waking was gone. He must have slept well. So that was it. Believing she had found the reason, Iris's gaze on Leo softened considerably. She asked what Leo would like for breakfast. Leo declared he wanted meat. Garrett returned with dew on his hair. He reported that the messenger was acting on the orders of Damon Valerius. The family head, Marcus, had entered a secluded retreat several days ago. Damon, the younger brother of the Duke of the West? Julian frowned slightly. Marcus Valerius, the Duke of the West, was a powerful and decisive ruler who governed his domain with an iron fist. With such an elder brother, the untitled Damon had always remained in the background and rarely visited the Sterling family. Now, with the head of the family in seclusion, Damon was inviting the Duke for a drink, following his brother's instructions for the opening of the vintage. It all sounded perfectly plausible. Leo asked the pensive Julian if they were going to Mount Moriah. Julian replied that Leo would come with him. He had initially planned to leave Leo at home, but the thought of the unpredictable Miles Corbin possibly showing up made him decide to take the boy along. Mount Moriah, Leo's hand, hidden in his sleeve, clenched tightly. That place was not a good destination for him in his current state. A clear, resonant voice called out from a distance. A girl in a dark dress shot into the room like an arrow, heading straight for Leo's chest. Julian moved like lightning, pulling Leo into his arms and letting his sister tumble onto the rug. Sylvie spat out a mouthful of dust and scrambled up, annoyed. Then she saw the small boy standing beside her brother and forgot all about her fall. She asked who he was. Leo instinctively tried to back away, but the girl grabbed his sleeve. She asked if he was her brother's new attendant, ignoring her brother's glare and staring intently at Leo's face. She exclaimed that he was very handsome. Leo looked at Sylvie's delicate hands and felt a shiver of fear. He was not even 10 years old. She asked what use a younger attendant would be to her brother, and suggested he be given to her instead. This young lady was no ordinary girl. If he became her attendant, his small body would likely not last 3 days. Leo looked pleadingly at Julian and said in a small voice that he was useful. He had to warm the young lord's bed. The room fell silent. Garrett, his hair still damp with dew, looked at the young lord in shock, then at Iris. Iris, looking ill, rescued Leo from the young lady's grasp. She told Leo that was not called warming the bed and that he shouldn't talk like that. Julian, feeling he had corrupted the child, looked displeased. He reprimanded Sylvie and forbade her from going to the west. Sylvie retorted, asking why she couldn't go, that she wanted to go. She slammed her hand on a nearby pearwood stool. With a crack, the stool splintered into pieces. Julian said her name, Sylvie Sterling. His tone was not harsh, but the young lady visibly flinched. She stubbornly glanced at Leo and huffed that if she couldn't go, she couldn't go. It's not like she cared. With that, she stormed off. Leo sighed, wishing he could give his spot on the trip to Sylvie, but he didn't know how to ask. At this time in his past life, he hadn't even known about the Valerius family. He only remembered Aaron carrying him as they fled, being intercepted 3 times by countless white-robed cultivators. He tried to reason with Julian, saying he wouldn't go to Mount Moriah, that the young lady should go instead. Iris, carrying a bowl of medicine, came over and tried to coax him, saying that Mount Moriah was different from Stellarmont. At the foot of the mountain was the western capital, Xianyang, a very lively place. Leo's nose twitched. He recognized the scent of ether bomb. Ether Balm had similar properties to Harrowroot, both being spiritual restoratives, but it was much more valuable and lacked the unpleasant ammoniac smell. Julian was looking through letters in a sandalwood box, ignoring Iris's arrival. Iris, seeing the young lord treating her like air, stamped her foot in frustration. She poured out a little of the overflowing medicine and handed the bowl to Leo, telling him to make the young lord drink it. Leo took the bowl and walked unsteadily to Julian's side. He tilted his head, looked at him, and then took a small sip himself. Ether Balm, Spirit Mend, 3-leaf herb, and a few other ingredients he couldn't identify. It was a concoction for various ailments, not just for restoring the spirit. What was wrong with this man's body? Julian looked up from his letters, amused and exasperated. This greedy little cat would eat anything, even stolen medicine. He asked if it tasted good. Leo wrinkled his nose and said it was bitter, but his mother had told him that good medicine is bitter to the taste. Setting a good example for the child was important. Julian took the bowl and drank it all in one go. Leo took the empty bowl, greatly pleased. Judging by Iris's reaction, the young lord probably did not take his medicine regularly. The young Julian Sterling was probably only 12 now, a rebellious age. He had to be handled with care. Iris left with the empty bowl, satisfied. Julian returned to his letters. Whenever someone from Mount Moriah came, they would bring a letter from the Valerius brothers. It was mostly Victor's rambling, with the taciturn Vincent adding at most a line at the end. The most recent letter was an invitation to go goose hunting on Mount Moriah during the Double Ninth Festival, with no mention of the century-old vintage. And this time, the messenger had come empty-handed. Closing the box, Julian stood up and took Leo to see his father before departing immediately. The snow and wind of the past few days had finally subsided. The slender young maple trees had been battered, their branches now bare. The century-old maples, however, were unscathed, still full of vibrant leaves that fell lazily to the ground. Leo hugged one of the old maples and refused to leave. When asked why, he couldn't very well tell Julian that he was Leon Croy's son and the Valerius family had been trying to capture him. The most likely thing Julian would do was hand him over to the king. Leo was troubled. He said he was wearing the young lord's clothes, and if anyone saw him, they would beat him to death. Julian paused, only then realizing that Leo was wearing his old clothes. In the Sterling family, attendants held a high status, practically equivalent to disciples, though each was attached to a specific person. The Sterlings treated them as peers. There was certainly no danger of being beaten to death for wearing the young lord's clothes. He patted the small head with a pang of sympathy, assuring him it was fine. He told him not to leave his side once they were out, and no one would bully him. Reluctantly, Leo was brought by Julian to Jade Crossing, the Duke's residence. Duke Sterling was a tall man, and his presence up close was imposing. His cold, star-like gaze swept over Leo, and he let out a sound of surprise. A large hand suddenly gripped Leo's wrist. Leo instinctively reached for a blade, but finding his waist empty, he had to force himself to resist the urge to break the Duke's wrist. The Duke remarked on the boy's broad etheric channels and superior aptitude, asking where he had come from. Julian explained Leo's apparent identity as a child of the Ashworth family, whose parents were dead and who had been mistreated by his uncle and aunt. The Duke declared it a criminal waste of talent, squeezing Leo's thin wrist angrily. Leo put on an innocent face. The Duke took a pigeon egg-sized Ethereum crystal from his sleeve and gave it to him, telling him that from now on, he was a member of the Sterling family, and with diligent training he would surely achieve great things. Holding the crystal-clear Ethereum, Leo followed the young lord into the car with a heavy heart. Julian, with a strange smile in his eyes, told him to put away the gift from his father. Leo asked what it was. This Ethereum crystal was polished smooth, without any sharp edges, the kind of thing wealthy families like the Sterlings gave their children to play with, quite different from the ones cultivators set in their swords. As a child who had supposedly never seen the world, Leo could not act knowledgeable. Julian explained that it was Ethereum. He took out 2 more from his own sleeve and gave them to Leo, explaining their origin. Ancient etheric arts had been lost, and the cultivator families had been reduced to relying on talismans and artifacts. Then one day, while chasing a deer into the mountains, they discovered a spirit stone, as brilliant as glass, which they named Ethereum. The discovery of Ethereum led to a resurgence of the etheric path, and cultivators, who had been on the verge of becoming mere charlatans, could once again ride the wind on their blades. The west was not as cold as the north. The autumn sky was clear, and wild geese flew south. Mount Moriah was indeed a mountain, and the Valerius family lived on it. Below was the capital of the west. Stellarmont was some distance from the northern capital, but Mount Moriah was closely connected to the western capital and was bustling with activity. At the foot of the mountain, a crowd of people and carts laden with gold, silver, and grain blocked the gate. The messenger apologized profusely for the congestion, explaining that it was the autumn tribute, and all the regional lords were present. He flew ahead on his blade to announce their arrival. Upon learning of the Duke's arrival, a group of white-robed cultivators immediately appeared, clearing a path for the Sterlings by directing the cargo carts to the side of the road. Dukes and marquises paid tribute to the king once a year, but the rules for collecting tribute from vassals varied by domain. The north collected tribute in summer and at the end of the year, while the west collected it 4 times a year. This was the autumn tribute. Damon Valerius, also dressed in a wide-sleeved white robe with a white tiger fur collar, rushed out to greet the Sterlings, looking utterly overwhelmed. He apologized for the chaos, explaining that with his brother in seclusion, he was struggling to manage everything. Victor Valerius, who came out with his uncle to greet the guests, looked not at all pleased to see Julian. In fact, his face held a suppressed anger. His brother Vincent stood beside him, looking haggard and expressionless. Leo, standing behind Julian, narrowed his eyes. Weren't these 2 brothers as close to Julian as could be? Why did they look as if their father had just died upon seeing him? He remembered that nothing major had happened to the Valerius family in his past life until he had crushed Marcus Valerius's spirit, which had led to their decline. The Valerius twins were identical, but there were subtle differences. Victor's eyes slanted upward, while Vincent's slanted slightly downward, reflecting their respective personalities. The young Valerius brothers had not yet learned to conceal their emotions. Their feelings were written all over their faces. Vincent tugged at his brother's sleeve, reminding him not to get agitated. Victor snapped back to his senses and bowed to Duke Sterling, apologizing for his father's inability to greet him due to his seclusion. The Duke laughed it off, saying it was no matter, though it was a pity he couldn't drink with Marcus. He then went with Damon to the main hall. Julian and the Valerius brothers remained where they were. Julian asked if they weren't going to offer him a cup of tea. Victor retorted sarcastically that after all that medicine, he couldn't possibly have room for tea. He then turned and led Julian toward their courtyard. Julian remembered his promise to Leo to keep him close, and held his small hand as they climbed the steps. But children are restless, and Leo quickly let go to look around curiously. Victor, his face darkening further at Julian's knowing look, burst out, asking how he knew. Julian simply watched him with an enigmatic expression. Victor couldn't hold it in any longer. He exclaimed that he knew his uncle was useless and had told him not to tell Julian. He confessed that their father was in trouble, the house was in chaos, and his uncle had wanted to consult with Julian's father. So what was Julian doing here, meddling? As he spoke, his eyes reddened. So, the century-old vintage was just a pretext. Julian understood what was happening, and his lips thinned into a straight line. Leo was not interested in these children's major events. He leaned against a wall, playing with a stray cat. Couldn't be anything too serious. A green-feathered, red-beaked parrot stood on a golden perch under the eaves, idly shaking its head. Leo picked up a small twig and poked its tail. The parrot, displeased, squawked at him, asking why he didn't just use fox fur. Leo found this amusing. He tossed the twig and flicked the bird's head with his finger, asking what fox fur. The parrot, annoyed, scolded him again, saying if there wasn't enough tiger fur, why not just use fox fur? Hearing this, Victor's face flushed. He snapped at the bird to shut up. The parrot took a few steps on its perch and replied with a defiant squawk. Victor, fuming, rolled up his sleeves to grab the parrot and teach it a lesson. The parrot shrieked, "Why not just use fox fur?" Then squawked again. Leo couldn't help but laugh. The Valerius family was known for their tiger-taming prowess. When their sons turned 15, they had to hunt a tiger in the mountains to prove their bravery. The white tiger fur on their collars was a symbol of this. In his past life, Leo had mocked them for this, as white tigers were rare, and with so many Valerius sons, they must have been dyeing yellow tiger pelts white. He had never imagined they would stoop to using fox fur. Only then did Victor notice Julian's small companion. A handsome child, though a bit thin. He asked who he was. Julian beckoned for Leo to come over, introducing him as his father's new disciple, Leo, and telling him to greet the Valerius brothers. Leo politely greeted them, his clear, innocent eyes asking in a small voice if the fur on the Valerius collars was tiger or fox. He was still mindful of the lessons Julian was supposed to be teaching him. His deliberately quiet question was heard by all three older boys. Victor looked ill. He nudged Julian's shoulder, asking where he had found this kid, and why he was so cheeky. Julian blocked the hand that was about to flick Leo's head, explaining that he was just learning to read and couldn't tell the difference between tiger and fox. A young man's emotions come and go quickly. After a few words, Victor's attitude toward Julian returned to normal. He no longer accused him of coming to gloat, though his smile was still strained. Julian asked in a low voice what had happened to his uncle. Victor hesitated, about to speak, but was preempted by his usually silent brother. Vincent stated flatly that their father was in seclusion for a few years. Cultivators would sometimes enter seclusion when they hit a bottleneck or had a sudden insight. But with two young sons and an unreliable brother, would Marcus Valerius really choose to go into seclusion for several years at this time? There was another possibility. He had been unexpectedly injured and needed to recuperate in seclusion. Julian asked no more questions. The atmosphere at Mount Moriah was very different from Stellarmont. The Valerius family had a strict hierarchy, distinguished by the number of black stripes on their collars. Mundane servants had to kneel before ether wielders. As Leo followed Julian to the front courtyard, a line of servants sweeping the corridor knelt before them. On the day of the autumn tribute, Mount Moriah held a banquet. The regional lords of the West were gathered in the front courtyard, making a lively scene. Food and wine were already on the tables. On a stage, scantily clad mundane dancers moved gracefully to the music. Duke Sterling followed Damon to the head table with a normal expression, greeting the Western vassals with a hearty laugh. He claimed he was just a man who loved his wine, here to taste Mount Moriah's century-old vintage, and had not expected to run into the autumn tribute, apologizing for the intrusion. The vassals replied that it was no intrusion at all. After taking their seats, they all stole glances at the unfamiliar ruler of the north. Duke Stirling was known for his straightforward and unpretentious nature, seeming much more approachable than the inscrutable Marcus Valerius. The 100-year-old wine was opened, and its rich aroma exploded like a burst honeycomb, spreading for miles. A middle-aged man with an Ethereum-studded sword at his waist, a man who moved with the confidence of a powerful ether wielder. One of Marcus Valerius's most trusted vassals stood up to toast the Duke. Duke Stirling recognized the man and raised his cup to meet his. Other prominent lords and attendants, judging their own status, prepared to offer toasts as well. Normally, those of slightly lower rank could toast the young lord, but since neither Julian nor Victor were yet 15 and could not drink, they were spared the ordeal. Whispers circulated among the guests about the Duke's son, praising his talent and handsome appearance. They spoke of how he could ride a blade at the age of 7, a once-in-a-generation genius not just for the Stirling family, but for the entire kingdom. But they also whispered that he had been frail for the past 2 years, even missing last year's hunt at Clearwater. Rumors spread that he was so ill he could no longer lift a sword, and the Duke was considering naming a new heir. They spoke of how great talent often leads to an early demise, how fame at a young age is not always a good thing. They all stole glances at the handsome, bamboo-straight Julian, discussing the legendary young lord in low voices, each acting as if they were privy to the Stirling family's deepest secrets. Leo stuffed food into his mouth while listening to the gossip. He was just getting into it when a sudden cheer erupted. Several large guards came forward and removed the red carpet the dancers had been performing on. The autumn tribute had a traditional event. Each family would send an ether wielder to the stage to duel with swords without Ethereum. With Marcus Valerius absent and a foreign duke who had no authority over them present, the vassals were much more relaxed and clamored for prizes. The lord who had just toasted the duke placed 10 egg-sized Ethereum crystals on a silver tray with a clatter, announcing that he would start the bidding. As soon as he finished speaking, a young man from his side leaped onto the stage. Someone in the crowd immediately recognized him as Ronan of the Broken Blade. This man was a renowned master of the Warren family, known for his signature move of breaking his opponent's weapon. He was a spirited young man with thick eyebrows and fierce eyes that shone with a sharp light. With him on the stage, the other families became more cautious. Someone good-naturedly teased Lord Warren, saying it was unfair to send out the Broken Blade right at the start, leaving no chance for anyone else to win. Lord Warren playfully demanded they put up their Ethereum if they were too scared to fight. Despite the banter, someone still accepted the challenge. Ronan of the Broken Blade smiled and bowed, revealing a sharp canine tooth. His opponent, seeing his relaxed demeanor, felt his own tension ease and charged forward with his sword. Ronan stood his ground, waiting for the moment his opponent reached him. Then he suddenly struck, his sword descending at an incredibly sharp angle. With a crisp crack, his opponent's sword snapped in two. The match was decided in 3 moves. Leo couldn't help but applaud the excellent swordsmanship. Lord Warren cheerfully collected the Ethereum from the defeated family's lord. Julian leaned in and whispered to Leo that in swords fitted for Ethereum, the core is hollow to channel power, and the weakest point is 3 inches from the hilt. The man's only advantage was his speed. Leo glanced at him sideways, a nostalgic feeling washing over him at the arrogant tone. The young Julian Stirling had been exceptionally talented, and when he gave advice, he was always brutally honest, often pointing out the secrets of others' techniques without a second thought, which had earned him many enemies. He had only learned to be more reserved after he turned 20. Julian had no idea that his serious lesson for a child was perceived by Leo as youthful arrogance. The duels on the stage continued. Several more challengers went up, and all had their swords broken by Ronan within 10 moves. Both commoners and ether wielders get carried away in the heat of a wager, and the banquet quickly became boisterous. After breaking another sword, Ronan turned to Damon and bowed, stating that he, though unworthy, wished to challenge a master of the Valerius family. It was a tradition for those who won several consecutive matches to make such a request, and if they won against a Valerius master, they would receive a generous reward. In the past, it had always been Marcus Valerius who made the decision. Damon, flustered for a moment, called out a name at random. Merrick. Victor tried to stop his uncle, but it was too late. He watched with a grim expression as a tall, scar-faced man from the Valerius family walked onto the stage. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Lord Warren's face turned pale. He called out to his champion, telling him they would forfeit. Julian explained that the man was one of Marcus Valerius's personal attendants, not noticing the sudden tension in Leo's posture. Victor, not wanting to deal with his uncle's blunder, also leaned in to explain to Leo, as Julian had, about Merrick's history. He said the man came from a minor family and had been pushed off a cliff by his stepmother as a child, disfiguring his face. His grandfather had found him, gave him the Valerius name, and he had been with his father ever since. Leo, of course, recognized Merrick. He would never forget the scar that ran from his eyebrow to the bridge of his nose. This man was not just Marcus Valerius's attendant. He was his rabid dog. He had twice escaped death at this man's hands, often looking back from Aaron's arms to see Merrick's savage, bloodthirsty face. He still remembered the heat of the blood that had sprayed from Aaron's severed arm. Most of his childhood nightmares featured this scarred face. At this time, shouldn't Merrick be out searching for him? Why was he at the Valerius family's autumn tribute banquet? Leo's hands and feet grew cold. He had been too careless. Many things in this life were different. His past experiences were useless. For a minor event at the autumn tribute, Damon's decision to call on Merrick was an overreaction. Damon seemed to realize his mistake and looked to Duke Sterling for help. The Duke waved his hand dismissively. Everyone in the West knew how formidable Merrick was. Seeing that Lord Warren had already forfeited, there was unlikely to be any trouble. But on the stage, Ronan seemed not to have heard his lord's words. He raised his hand and invited Merrick to make a move. The crowd was in an uproar. Merrick, holding a dull, black, broken sword, looked up with a blank expression. Before Lord Warren could intervene again, he stamped his foot and leaped into the air. The wooden stage groaned under the pressure. Merrick shot forward like an arrow, aiming straight for Ronan's head. They clashed a dozen times in the air, their movements a blur of afterimages, their blades striking with heavy blows. A scream came from the crowd. In the instant they collided, Merrick had severed Ronan's head. He held it in his hand. The young man's face still wore the excited smile of someone sparring with a master. The headless body, still in a sword-fighting stance, fell to the stage with a dull thud. Damon jumped to his feet, demanding to know why Merrick had killed the man when he was only supposed to be sparring. Merrick replied that he only knew how to kill. He dropped the head to the ground and looked up, his gaze fixed on Leo, who was sitting behind a low table. Leo felt as if he were being watched by a venomous snake, and his blood ran cold. But his face remained innocent and childlike. He met Merrick's gaze and stared back. After a moment of intense eye contact, Merrick turned and left the stage without another word. After the initial panic, Leo quickly calmed himself. When he was being hunted, he had only been 5 years old. A child's face changes every day. 3 years had passed. Merrick might not recognize him. Lord Warren leaped onto the stage and cradled the young, vibrant head. The handsome young man was still smiling, his small, white canine tooth glinting in the autumn sun, unaware that he had been decapitated. Holding the head in one hand and the body in the other, Lord Warren fought to control his emotions, but his eyes reddened. Damon, deeply apologetic, offered Lord Warren a great deal of compensation, saying that Merrick was reckless. But Lord Warren said nothing, simply holding Ronan's body, creating an awkward silence. Duke Sterling stepped in to mediate and managed to calm Lord Warren down. A duel without Ethereum, relying only on the wielder's own power, was meant to be a display of skill, not a fight to the death. The sight of blood was an ill omen. The dueling could not continue, and the banquet ended abruptly. Victor, his anger boiling over, complained to Julian about his uncle's incompetence, how he had managed to ruin a simple autumn tribute banquet. He lamented that there were still so many official documents to approve, but his uncle was only interested in drinking with Julian's father, leaving everything to him. He questioned how a 12-year-old was supposed to manage an entire domain, asking Julian if he could do it. He stopped mid-sentence, seeing Julian writing on a document with a brush. In the time it took him to speak, Julian had already approved 3. Julian told him that if he didn't know how, he should learn. With his father absent, someone had to take charge. He then stuck the 3 approved documents to Victor's forehead. The current head of the Valerius family, Marcus, was a very capable man, so much so that his 2 foolish sons had grown up knowing only how to cultivate and play, oblivious to everything else. This was why, when Leo had killed Marcus in his past life, the Valerius family had collapsed overnight. Victor tore the papers from his head, exclaiming in disbelief at how Julian knew how to do everything. Julian ignored him and turned to Leo, asking if he or Vincent would learn. Leo had at some point brought the parrot from the corridor inside. He was holding the green bird, letting it peck at the sleeping Vincent, who was slumped on a couch. Vincent had dark circles under his eyes, clearly from a lack of sleep. Victor grabbed the bird's beak just as it was about to poke his brother, telling Leo to leave him be and let him sleep. The parrot struggled free, hopped onto Leo's shoulder, and screeched, "Leave him be! Why not just use fox fur?" Victor, enraged, grabbed the bird by its wings and threw it out. Leo giggled, covering his mouth. He asked what the bird's name was. Julian, quickly scanning the documents on the table, replied absent-mindedly that its name was Kettle. Which kettle not to lift? Leo mused, finding the name amusing. He leaned against the window, watching Victor argue with the parrot, his eyes narrowing. The twin brothers had never known about their family's pursuit of him, so Merrick was likely not under their control. Now, with Marcus in seclusion, Merrick, that attack dog, was unlikely to act on his own. But he could not take the risk. Whether Merrick remembered him, knew his identity, or would make a move, were all unknowns. If he fell into Marcus Valerius's hands, a fate worse than death awaited him. To be reborn only to live a shorter life than before would be too pathetic. He looked back at Julian, who was rapidly reading through the documents. Leo jumped down from the couch, walked over to Julian, and tugged at his sleeve. Julian turned to him, asking what was wrong. Leo felt a pang of regret at having to say goodbye to this beautiful sight. He blinked and yawned. Seeing Leo was sleepy, Julian did not stay any longer. He bid farewell to the Valerius brothers and returned to his guest courtyard. Leo held onto Julian's sleeve all the way back. The Valerius family would not dare to act against him in front of outsiders. To save his own skin, he had to stay close to the young lord. But this was not a long-term solution. If Marcus Valerius later found a reason to demand him from the Sterling family, and the unsuspecting Sterlings handed him over, he would have no one to turn to. Julian, examining a spirit blade from the pile of gifts Damon had sent, told Leo to go bathe. The blade was 3 inches shorter than a standard spirit blade and much lighter, likely custom-made for Julian, considering his recent poor health. A spirit blade was a sword that could be fitted with Etherium and could channel etheric power. Noble sons usually received their own personal spirit blade at 15. Before that, they used ordinary ones gifted by their elders. Damon's gift was not unusual, but the several boxes of Etherium beside it were excessively valuable. Leo, twisting the hem of his robe, stood at the door of the washroom, looking at him with wide, pleading eyes. Julian turned to him. Leo, his small face scrunched up, said he didn't know how to use it and asked if they could bathe together. The small sword in Julian's hand clattered to the floor. He remembered a steamy hot spring pool. Leo had tightened the chains on his wrists, pinning him to the pool wall, and pressed his body against him. He had told him to get lost. Leo had bitten his earlobe and whispered huskily, asking if the virtuous Prince Sterling shouldn't personally remove what he had left inside him. He was not a stone. How could he be unmoved, especially when faced with that version of Leo? How could he truly be without guilt? The memory, seared into his soul, resurfaced at this inopportune moment. Julian closed his eyes, bent down to pick up the small sword, and stiffly led Leo to the washroom. Mount Moriah had a hot spring that flowed into every courtyard. The washroom had a small pool lined with green stones. A large tiger head was carved into the wall, continuously spouting water. A large vat of cool mountain spring water stood beside the pool. Julian turned the tiger head, closing the valve. He tested the water. It was a bit too hot. He ladled some cold water into it and told Leo to see if it was too hot. Leo kicked off his shoes and socks and dipped a foot in. He immediately pulled it back as if tickled, then giggled and put it in again, kicking the water a few times. He announced that it wasn't hot anymore. Turning to Julian, whose face was flushed from the steam, Leo touched the thin hemp cord around his neck. He walked barefoot and unsteadily toward Julian, then slipped, pulling Julian into the pool with him. With a splash, Julian, still in his underclothes, was soaked. He spat out a mouthful of water and scrambled to pull the struggling Leo up. Leo, standing now, complained that his clothes were wet. He pulled off his soaked undershirt, revealing the yellow jade pendant. The flawless, translucent deer-looking back jade pendant was tied with a thin hemp cord. A precious gem tied with hemp, a pearl covered in dust. It was a tragically absurd sight. This was the Marquis's seal of Leon Croy, the Lord of the Chase, announced to the world upon his enfeoffment. As a noble son, Julian naturally recognized it. He asked Leo about it. Leon Croy had rebelled against the Croy family and established his own house, and the king had made him the Lord of the Chase. He had enjoyed a moment of glory, but he had died young, his only son missing. The king had searched for a long time, finally finding Leo when he was 16. But Leo, who should have inherited his father's title, was not made the Lord of the Chase, but the Lord of the Exiles. Exiles and Chase, a world of difference. The duty of the Lord of the Exiles was to collect Etherium from all over the kingdom. Leo was ruthless and capricious, demanding more from those he disliked, especially in the West, where he had increased the tribute by 30%, leading to a conflict with Marcus Valerius. He remembered Victor coming to report the death, how shocked the Sterling family had been. They knew Leo was formidable, but they had never imagined he could kill someone as powerful as Marcus Valerius. The Lord of the Exiles had made his name in that battle, and the world's fear of Leo had grown ever since. Leo, seeing Julian staring at the pendant, knew he had recognized it. He sighed inwardly. Their unexpected meeting at Clearwater and being taken in by Julian was a stroke of luck he had never dreamed of in his past life. He had thought he could watch Julian grow up, win him over early, but fate had other plans. Julian, after holding the pendant for a long time, finally spoke, asking why he used a hemp cord to tie the jade. He said he would have Iris change it to a soft silk cord. Then he looked away and began to take off his wet underclothes. Leo would not let him off so easily. He asked if Julian didn't know what the pendant was. This matter had to be made clear today to ensure he wouldn't be handed over to the Valerius family. He stated that he was not Mr. Ashworth's nephew. He was Leon Croy's son. Julian looked at him in shock. He had thought the young Leo did not know his own identity until Miles Corbin found him, but it turned out the child had known all along. Leo's eyes reddened. He said he had seen that man today, the one who had hunted Aaron, the one with the scar on his face. He cried that they would kill him too, that Merrick would definitely come for him. Julian's pupils contracted. He asked if Leo was saying that the ones who had hunted him years ago were from the Valerius family. He finally understood why the Leo of his past life had targeted the Valerius family, why he had killed Marcus. If Marcus had been responsible for Leon Croy's death, he remembered how he had condemned Leo for killing Marcus. He reached out and held the trembling Leo, assuring him not to be afraid, that as long as he was there, no one would harm him. Leo lowered his eyes, hiding the mockery in them. What good was a child's promise of protection? Ultimately, he would be handed over to the Pine in the Snow Duke, who would in turn deliver him to the king. He pleaded for Julian to hand him over to the king for a reward if he must, but begged him not to give him to the Valerius family. A voice from outside suddenly announced that the Duke requested the young lord's presence in the side hall. According to the Valerius brothers, with Marcus in seclusion, their incompetent uncle could not make decisions and had sought out Julian's father for advice, hoping to use the Duke's name to intimidate the Western vassals and buy time. After a day of commotion, it was time for serious business. Duke Sterling never excluded his eldest son from important matters, so he had sent for him. Julian had no time to explain further to Leo. He simply said, "Don't be afraid, stay with me." Since Merrick was a threat to Leo, he could not leave him alone in the room. He buckled on the small sword he had just received, and with the newly dressed Leo trailing behind him, he followed the guard outside. It was completely dark. Mount Moriah forbade candles at night, and the guard's lantern was the only light. The buildings on the mountain were built into the hillside, with winding corridors connecting them. It was easy to get lost in the daytime, let alone in the dark. Julian was still thinking about Leo and didn't notice where the guard was leading them. After many twists and turns, they came to a nine-bend corridor. The guard handed a lantern to Julian, explaining that the area ahead was called the Plum Garden, where the Duke and the Second Master were, and that it was inconvenient for him to accompany them. With that, the guard stepped back and stood by a pillar, as if waiting. Ahead was a moon gate, seemingly leading to a garden. Julian frowned. Why would the two of them be having a late-night talk in such a remote place? He glanced at the small Leo beside him, who had his head down, lost in thought. Leo was clutching a small Ethereum crystal, slowly absorbing its power. Suddenly, a pale hand was offered to him. This hand was smaller than the one he remembered, and not as tan. He looked up at the young Julian and placed his free hand in his. No matter what, this boy, at this moment, truly wanted to protect him, even if it was just out of the Sterling family's innate sense of duty. As they stepped into the garden, the faint candlelight illuminated a small area around them. The cobblestone path was uneven, many of its stones missing. Julian raised the lantern and saw collapsed pavilions and overgrown weeds in the distance. He realized where they were and grabbed Leo to retreat, but it was too late. A figure shot out from the tall grass, blocking their exit. Julian quickly pushed Leo behind him and flicked a sliver of candlelight forward. The small flame collided with the figure in mid-air, revealing Merrick's scarred face. Leo gritted his teeth. It was just as he had feared. He dropped the now powdered Ethereum and was about to attack when he heard the sound of a sword being drawn. Julian, holding the ridiculously small sword, kicked the lantern into the air. Before Leo could stop him, Julian had charged forward. Leo was worried. Not only was he unsure if the 12-year-old Julian was a match for Merrick, but the world believed he was too weak to even lift a sword. With a hum, the Ethereum on the hilt activated, and a pale blue light instantly filled the blade. Julian held the small sword steady and met Merrick's dark short sword. With another hum, the Ethereum on Merrick's sword also activated. The candle went out, plunging them into darkness. Only two ghostly blue lights could be seen clashing dozens of times in the air. The 12-year-old Julian could actually withstand Merrick's killing blows, which surprised Leo. His own aptitude was considered excellent, yet at 12, he couldn't have lasted 5 moves against Merrick. Was Julian some kind of prodigy? Before Leo could get a better look, Julian suddenly flew toward him on his blade, grabbed him and fled. He could even ride a blade. The reason one usually waited until 15 to forge a personal spirit blade was that blade riding required a strong connection between soul and psyche, a level of control generally not achieved before that age. Julian held Leo tightly, crushed an Ethereum crystal from his sleeve, and a surge of power coursed through him. The spirit blade shot forward like a streak of light, but the garden ended at a cliff face. As he tried to turn and fly upward, Merrick was already upon them. A wave of dizziness hit Julian. He shook his head and stumbled off the flying blade. Leo spotted a stone door at the base of the cliff. A sharp, killing intent tore through the cool night air, descending from above with the force of a thunderbolt. Leo felt a hard shove that sent him tumbling through the stone door and down several stone steps. He landed hard, scraping his palms on the rough stone. Hissing in pain, he scrambled up, blinded by the bright candlelight. A young, cold voice from the flickering light asked who was there. Before he could react, a sword light shot toward him. He rolled away, dodging the deadly attack, but before he could get back on his feet, Vincent had leaped forward and pressed his sword to his neck. Victor, dressed in mourning clothes, ran over, telling his brother not to kill him. It was a wide chamber carved out of the mountain, hung with white banners. In the center was an exquisite stone coffin. Wisps of white vapor continuously rose from it, indicating it was filled with ice. Seeing the two brothers in mourning clothes, it was clear what had happened. Their father, the Duke of the West, Marcus Valerius, was dead. They were keeping a secret, solitary vigil at night. Vincent, staring at Leo, did not lower his sword, stating that he had seen. Victor, looking at Leo's innocent face, explained to his brother that he was Julian's disciple and they couldn't kill him, or the matter would be even harder to contain. He asked how Leo had gotten there. Leo, unconcerned by the two boys' threats, shouted that Merrick was outside, trying to kill Julian. Victor was shocked. They had indeed stationed Merrick outside as a guard. If Julian had stumbled in, he would certainly have run into him. He rushed up the steps to open the door. A wall of flames and thick smoke billowed in, but there was no sign of Julian. The area outside was full of dry grass and wood, which had caught fire instantly. The flames licked at the stone door, forcing Victor back down the steps. Leo understood. Julian must have set the fire. The Valerius family would not dare to kill the young lord of Stellarmont on their own turf. As long as he attracted attention, he would be safe. Victor, realizing this as well, yelled for them to close the door. The fire would draw a crowd, and then their father's death would no longer be a secret. While the brothers struggled with the door, Leo had already scrambled onto the stone coffin. It was filled with blocks of ice, and a layer of frost coated its edges. Beneath the ice lay a man in a white robe with a collar of dense white tiger fur, and on his wrist was a gold bracer with a white tiger motif set with ethereum. Even in death, he exuded an air of indomitable authority. But his handsome, sharp-featured face had collapsed, barely recognizable as Marcus Valerius. The state of his body was just like the soul-shattered eldest Ashworth son. Could Marcus Valerius have been soul-shattered as well? Without a mirror, he couldn't be sure, but Leo was almost certain. Arthur Ashworth, Marcus Valerius, men who should have lived for several more years had all died at the time of his rebirth, and all by soul-shattering. And in his past life, he had been the one to crush their souls. The fire was highly visible on the dark mountain. Soon, a crowd of firefighters and onlookers gathered. The stone door had not been fully closed. The two soot-covered Valerius brothers stood there in disarray. The hurried arrival of Damon, who saw the scene, made him beat his chest in despair. Most of the Western vassals were present. The news of Marcus Valerius's death could no longer be concealed. The extinguished candles were relit, and the entire mountain was as bright as day, exposing all its hidden secrets. The Lord was dead. What had happened? Several prominent vassals rushed into the stone chamber and, upon seeing Marcus's body, began to wail. The chamber was in chaos. Leo squeezed his way out of the crowd. He saw Sterling family guards helping Julian stand by the edge of the freshly extinguished, muddy ground. Duke Sterling stood beside him, his expression grim. Merrick knelt on one knee on the stone paving, silent. Leo ran over and checked Julian, who had some minor cuts and bruises but seemed otherwise unharmed. Julian kept his head down, not speaking. A splitting pain erupted in his spirit, blurring his vision. He could vaguely hear Leo's voice but couldn't make out the direction. Fortunately, he was used to this pain and showed no outward signs of discomfort. Damon ran over, overwhelmed, and kicked Merrick. He demanded to know why he had attacked the young lord when he was supposed to be guarding the garden. Merrick replied that he was a blade for killing, not a dog for guarding. He was kicked off balance but simply stood up and stared at Damon. The air grew tense. Duke Sterling's deep voice cut through the silence, telling Damon that this was not the time to be concerned with such matters. He gestured for the Sterling guards to clear the area. The tomb was crowded. It was unseemly. Merrick turned without a word and flew on his blade into the stone chamber, standing guard by the coffin with his sword. The immense power radiating from him, a pressure that came with great strength, forced everyone back 3 steps. The dark-robed Sterling guards entered and escorted the wailing vassals, whether their grief was genuine or not, out of the chamber. The room finally fell silent. Duke Sterling entered and stood before the coffin, looking at Marcus for a long time without speaking. The night wind blew through the doorway, making the white candles flicker. He asked what had happened. Victor, his eyes red, explained that his father had been sparring with someone when he had suddenly collapsed. Medicine had no effect, and a summoning rite had yielded no response. Julian walked in slowly, his step steady, his face calm. At his father's signal, he stepped forward to pay his respects to Marcus. Leo stood to the side, arms crossed, with no intention of bowing. He cursed himself for having worried for nothing. Since Marcus Valerius was already dead, the Valerius family was in disarray and no longer a threat. He really hadn't needed to reveal his identity to Julian. What a waste. A cheerful, somewhat grating voice came from the doorway. Before anyone could turn, Merrick had shot toward the entrance. Two streams of power collided in the air, shattering the half-open stone door. The newcomer, holding a plain black staff that looked more like a fire poker than a spirit weapon, cried out for them to talk things out and not fight. The ugly staff moved like a living thing in his hands, twisting and turning, precisely deflecting each of Merrick's killing blows. Leo's eyes were fixed on the man in red. He recognized the staff, which looked like a charred stick, as Springtrace. He shouted its name. The man in red, unwilling to continue the fight, rolled on the ground, unconcerned with how ungraceful the move was, and ended up at Duke Sterling's feet. The Duke raised his hand to stop Merrick's pursuit. He looked down at the man who was now making faces at Merrick and asked, "Alistair, what are you doing here?" Hearing the name, Julian looked up, a sense of dread washing over him. The master whom Leo had personally killed in his past life, Miles Corbin, had the formal name Alistair. The man protested that it wasn't his idea to be there. Marcus Valerius had refused to let him leave. He scrambled up, dusting off his crimson robes and gold-trimmed tunic, the typical extravagant attire of the Corbin family from the south, which clashed with the somber morning hall. Victor couldn't help but retort that he was lying, that he had been freeloading at their home and had caused his father's death. The man, whose name was Miles, chided the boy, saying that one could eat whatever one wanted, but one couldn't speak carelessly. He insisted that he hadn't killed Marcus. He wasn't strong enough to beat him, and they should be reasonable. Miles had a handsome face, but his posture and speech were undignified, like a wild monkey from the mountains, completely lacking the grand air of the Corbin family. After extinguishing the fire and calming the wailing vassals outside, Damon returned, overwhelmed, to find Miles causing a scene in the morning hall. He demanded to know what he was doing there. Miles, hiding behind the Duke, retorted that they had forbidden him from leaving Mount Moriah, but not from leaving his courtyard. He then spotted the pale-faced Julian and greeted him as his dear nephew, asking why he looked so unwell. His gaze then shifted to the small Leo beside Julian. Julian stepped forward, blocking Miles's view of Leo, and bowed, addressing him as Uncle Miles. Before he could finish, he collapsed. Miles caught him just in time. He exclaimed at how cold the boy's sweat was. He lifted him into his arms and felt a tug on his robe. He looked down to see the small child who had been staring at him earlier. Leo, fighting to keep his voice steady, looked up at Miles's young, handsome face and explained that the young lord had fought with Merrick and needed a doctor. The doctor could find no clear cause, attributing Julian's condition to having overexerted himself by riding a blade, which had damaged his spirit, and saying he would recover after a few days' rest. Miles scoffed that the doctor was a quack. Leo, out of habit, retorted that if he thought the man was a quack, he should try to heal him himself. Miles circled Leo, then suddenly flicked him on the head, remarking that he was an interesting kid. Leo rubbed the spot and glared at him. After a moment, his eyes grew misty. It had been so long, so very long, since he had heard that voice, since anyone had flicked his head. Miles, scratching his head, knelt down to be at eye level with Leo, asking why he was crying, and offered to let him flick him back. Leo wiped his eyes and did just that. Miles yelped in pain, exclaiming that he had actually done it. The night of chaos finally came to an end.